Have you tried minions in Diablo 4 and felt like they fell a little flat? Well, I'm here to show you with a little itemization and some key items. They are OP. So introducing the MinionMancer. Let's get into it. So as in every video, I want to give a quick caveat. The gameplay above is not some specially farmed nightmare dungeons. It's just first come, first serve. I think all the nightmare dungeons we ran in this video were anywhere from +6 monster level to +10. And we're not even max level. You know, the last 11 levels to get to 100, every single one of those Paragon points is going to matter a lot. So this thing is nowhere near the cap of its damage. Now in the gameplay above, you might also think, Fluff, well, this looks like a Bone Spear build. And don't be fooled. We are spamming Bone Spear, and we're going to explain all of this, and it's going to make a lot of sense. But Bone Spear is basically doing no damage whatsoever. This is not a Bone Spear build. This is strictly a minion build. The sort of central idea is that, you know, our minions are doing all the heavy lifting here. We're literally just sniping back, sitting back, proccing vulnerable on all the enemies, proccing lucky hit, which again, we'll get into. And having just tons of buffs for our minions, and on top of that, using Ring of Mendeln is insane. Now, I've been seeing a ton of Ring of Mendeln builds pop up all over the internet. And I gotta say, I see people, you know, sort of split between, I'm gonna have Bone Spear do my damage, and I'm gonna invest a little bit into minions, and then if I stack my own damage, like the Ring of Mendeln proc will go up a little bit more. Or I see people trying to use Shadow Blight, and you know, it's sort of okay-ish at scaling the Mendeln damage. But in this, we're going all minions. Our minions is doing everything. And I think this is the best way to play Ring of Mendeln and the best way to play minions, period, in Diablo 4 in its current state. This build does revolve around the Ring of Mendeln. Now, that being said, this build is playable without the Ring of Mendeln. But that being said, this build is definitely playable without the Ring of Mendeln. The Ring of Mendeln literally just takes it to the next level where you're just kind of one-shotting elite packs and just wiping the screen. This build can definitely do, you know, monster level +3 nightmare dungeons without the Ring of Mendeln. It is slower. I'm not going to lie to you. It is slower. But our minions are doing all the heavy lifting here, and we're just buffing the crap out of them. And the Ring of Mendeln procs are just the icing on the cake. So what is Ring of Mendeln? So Ring of Mendeln is a unique ring inside of the game of Diablo 4, which basically says a lucky hit has a 10% chance to empower all of your minions, causing the next attack from them to explode, doing a range of physical damage. And if you guys don't know, you know, lucky hit is a stat that you can sort of scale. It is a stat that you can put on your gear. And so every point of lucky hit that you can get sort of increases the chances that you're going to get Ring of Mendeln procs. But it's actually not quite that simple, right? So you might think, oh, if I stack, you know, 30% lucky hit on my gear, basically any skill I cast will have this 30% chance to proc lucky and get those explosions. Well, you'd be wrong. Skills themselves have a base lucky hit chance. So you can see here, Blight has 57%. We're stacking a lot of lucky, so these numbers are a bit skewed. But Sever has 28%. Blood Surge and Blood Lance, you know, really measly things. But then if you look over here at Bone Spear, 71% chance with, you know, a fully stacked lucky character. And that's just on hit. Bone Spear pierces, Bone Spear shards break into different things. And so this thing triggers lucky hit like you wouldn't believe. And you'll see this entire screen just get wiped out by Mendeln procs because Bone Spear is just the best way. Now we've seen other people use Bone Splinters because, you know, if you hit up with all three, it's a somewhat decent, it's like a 70% chance to proc lucky if you hit all one target. But I promise you Bone Spear is 1,000 times better because it's like piercing through and it's breaking the different shards and everything's getting hit with vulnerable, and vulnerable literally just scales all of your damage with a minion build. So it is absolutely the best way to play. But enough about that. Like, let's just get into the build itself. And then at the end of the video, guys, I'm gonna have just a section where we talk about sort of all the like the little caveats and the weird things to know about minions and minion damage, and really just sort of like the subtle things I think will change probably. But anyways, let's just get into the build. We'll present the build, and at the end of the video, you guys can skip forward and see all like the little rules. All right, so we are picking up Bone Splinters and Enhanced Bone Splinters. No real reason why. We just need to waste 2 points at the start of the skill tree to make our way down to the next part, which is, you know, I don't like that about Diablo 4, but it is what it is. We then pick up 1 point in Bone Spear, 1 point in Enhanced Bone Spear, which causes the break in the 3 shards. And again, you know, each shard is proccing lucky, which is crazy. And then we pick up Paranormal Bone Spear, which increases its chance to crit. And on top of that, if it does crit, it's going to fire 2 additional bone shards, which is fantastic. We are stacking crit in this build, so this thing's going to go off crazy. And you might be like, why would you stack crit if you're literally investing no points into Bone Spear whatsoever? Well, that's because minions get 30% of our crit chance. So the more crit that you get for yourself, the more crit the minions will get. And we want minions to crit because you can't crit the Ring of Mendeln proc. We're picking up Hued Flesh. This thing is pretty nutty. We get a lucky hit. Your damage has a chance to create a corpse of the target. And of course, we're scaling lucky hit here. So this thing is going off like nuts. And the reason we picked that is because we skip all the way down here to Necrotic Carapace. When a corpse is formed by your skills or your minions, you fortify for 6% of your base life. So between this, and we'll get to some of the minions in a second, you have a pretty good uptime of Fortify, especially if there's a very large pack on your screen. Next up on the tree, we are investing into Bone Prison. And I want to give a caveat in this. We'll have a section where we're going to talk about Bone Prison, why I think it's the best skill right now. But I want to kind of future-proof this video by giving you alternatives, because I do think the Bone Prison will probably get nerfed. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But right now, this is what we're choosing to run. We're picking Bone Prison because it traps enemies, which is fantastic because you don't want to get hit, and we'll talk about that later. You want to try to avoid taking any form of damage. But on top of that, for some reason, in the current state of the game, if you pick up Ghastly Bone Prison and you just cast... But on top of that, it procs Lucky with like 100% accuracy. And I think this is a bug. But basically, in the game right now, if you just pick the rune that says Ghastly Bone Prison, enemies inside Bone Prison are made vulnerable. This, for some reason, triggers Lucky Hit. Now, we've also seen a lot of people use the aspect that takes the Bone Prison. When a piece of it's destroyed, it deals blank damage, and that also procs a lot of Lucky Hit, but it's actually not necessary in the current state of the game. So you don't need to waste, a sort of offensive aspect on your gear just to run this. It will proc the Lucky Hit without triggering the explosion. However, if this gets fixed, I would still say the Bone Prison is a better aspect if that Codex power still works. And then if the Codex power doesn't work, then I think Corpse Tendrils will be the best choice. And again, we'll touch on that in just a minute. The other reason I love Bone Prison here is because, again, we are spamming Bone Spear, and we don't have any sort of generator in this build. We are relying solely on essence cost reduction. And in the Paragon board, we have the Bone board where we get essence on kill. So we get up to, I think, four essence on kill. So just between essence on kill, essence cost reduction, and our mages, which we'll again talk about in a minute, it is enough juice to keep up Bone Spear. Also on this part of the tree, you pick up Skeletal Warrior Mastery. We are full minion build, so each one of these masteries, Golem, Skeletal Warrior, Skeletal Mage, these are all absolutely mandatory for their survivability and their damage. We pick up Grim Harvest, and this is absolutely key in this build as well. We are going to be spamming this a lot to keep up the cost of Bone Spear. And again, Bone Spear is just absolute insane lucky hit chance. It's just nutty. We also pick it Fueled by Death because, again, we are consuming a lot of corpses. We're consuming a corpse basically every other second. That's sort of the play style of this. You're spamming Bone Spear, and then, between maybe every couple casts, you cast like a raised skeleton, and the raised skeleton will consume a corpse, and that's going to trigger 6 essence for yourself. Coming down to the next here, we have Curses. We're going to use Decrepify, not only because Decrepify debuffs the enemy's damage, but there is a rune that says Aberrant Decrepify, which enemies will have a chance to reduce your cooldowns by 1 second. And that also scales off of Lucky. So again, since we're stacking Lucky, the value of this is super good. We also get a chance to stun for 2 seconds based on our Lucky hit. And again, we're stacking Lucky, so that's very, very good. We're also picking Amplify Damage, which is just 9% increased damage to cursed enemies. We're picking up Death's Embrace, which is 6% damage to close enemies and 9% damage reduction for enemies that are close. And we pick up Death's Reach because we're sort of all over the place. We want to sort of stay at range. I think that that's the ideal place to be, but we're certainly not stacking our damage for close or distant targets. It's just we have a lot of free points because we're not investing in Bone Spear. Of course, pick up the Skeletal Mage Mastery. That goes without saying. And we talked about this earlier, Necrotic Carapace. This is going to be super vital for keeping up Fortify. And there's going to be other ways you can keep up Fortify as well. And we'll talk about that later. Coming down to the next here, we pick up Golem Mastery. Again, Masteries are a must. We're going to pick up Bone Storm. This is basically a defensive cooldown. You can use it offensively as well for that extra 20% chance to crit. But mostly defensively is why we include it in the build. It is, 15% DR, 20% chance to crit. And because of an aspect we have on our gear, we get 5% barrier every single time it hits. And that's also cast on our golem, and we are using a golem in this build. So we get that 5% shield proc rate for not only our Bone Storm, but the golem's Bone Storm. We pick up literally every single minion part of the skill tree here. Inspiring Leader, that just says if you're over 80% health, you want to maintain that 80% plus health. Your minions get attack speed. We'll sort of talk about this at the end of the video. Attack speed for minions isn't insane in the current state of the game, but I do believe it will get buffed. More on that later. We're getting Bonded in Essence, so they heal for that additional amount. We are spamming, literally spamming this for the Essence regen for Bone Spear, so they are constantly topped off at health. I rarely have minions die. Like, I can think of maybe one time I've had mages die since I've been level 60. And then we're using Hellbent Commander. We're getting +3 on this one because we have it on our necklace, but basically minions deal 60% increased damage the closer you are to them. Most of the time we're just going to gather around our mages, but every once in a while when we get overwhelmed, we're near all of our minions. And so it's just flat good. And then coming down here, you know, we sort of touched on this earlier, Kalan's Edict, right? So if you haven't taken damage for 2 seconds, your minions gain 15% attack speed. If you have at least 7 minions, that is doubled. So we get 30% attack speed because in this build, we have 13 minions. And we'll touch on that again later. Now, this isn't a really good passive. Again, the state of minion attack speed right now in the game is not great. And again, we've seen people try to use Shadow Blight, but the Shadow Blight uptime isn't also great unless you have a really nice, juicy pack. And you have to invest so many aspects into Shadow to make it sort of have uptime, and it's just not really worth it. And we'll talk about that when we talk about our aspects. It's really not that hard to keep up. I know people are like, it's impossible. It's so hard not to take damage. I'd say I have about, and when I'm in a Nightmare dungeon and I'm playing cleverly, I have about 65-70% uptime on Kalan's Edict, which is not 100%. And again, attack speed isn't super duper great. But this is just something we can get on the way because, again, our minions are doing all of our damage, and more attack speed for them is good. We've seen other people do Ossified Essence, and again, they're sort of splitting their damage between Bone Spear and their minions, and I just don't think it's as good as just going straight minions, or straight Bone Spear for that matter. But yeah, I do feel like this will get changed in probably Season 1, Season 2. I think that Ossified Essence and Shadow Blight are just flat good, and these other two, they sort of have like a pre-qualification for them being good. So I think that Blizzard will change that. They recently changed it to be 2 seconds instead of 3 seconds. So they did like a small buff to it, but I do think this will get changed in the future to be like the absolute best choice for minions. And speaking of minions, we are using Skeletal Warriors Reapers. Reapers have a 15% chance to carve flesh off enemies forming a corpse. Them forming a corpse is not only great because we need it for the essence regen because we're consuming those corpses, but it's also great for proccing Fortify anytime. Again, as before, we talked on our abilities. And Necrotic Carapace gives us a Fortify for 6% baseline anytime a corpse is formed. So it is double value, being really good in this build. We're using Skeletal Mages with Cold. Each time your Cold Mages deal damage to an enemy, you gain 2 Essence. This is actually really good. And it's so good, in fact, that we put this defensive aspect or utility aspect on our necklace. And that allows us to get +3 Skeletal Mages instead of +2. And this really helps with keeping your essence nice and topped off for spamming Bone Spear. Because again, it's all about spamming Bone Spear and getting procs of Ring of Mendeln. But not only that, we're using the aspect because it says every 10 seconds, Skeletal Mages cast a blizzard that deals, damage, continually chills for 8% over 6 seconds. This thing will actually freeze enemies really well. Freezing enemies is a sort of CC in this game, and we have a lot of damage effects that are based on CC, so that's just really good. It also sort of helps with, suppressor mobs, helps with like range mobs, that helps, keep really powerful chargers that come for you off screen sort of at bay. It is a pretty good offensive aspect, and for some reason it's on a defensive aspect, which makes it sort of even better. And then lastly, we're using the Iron Golem, and some of these choices, you might say like, okay, I've seen other people use Cold Mages where they become vulnerable when they're frozen. Same thing with Golem. We're not using the vulnerable slam attack. You don't need it, man. You will literally have more than 100% uptime on vulnerable because we are using the aspect that says Bone Spear's primary attack makes enemies vulnerable for 2.5 seconds. Literally everything you touch with Bone Spear, which will be the entire screen, will have permanent vulnerable. So getting vulnerable on your golem, getting vulnerable on your mages is just a waste. It's a total waste. In fact, if it were up to me, I wouldn't even have vulnerable on Bone Prison. It just so happens that currently Ghastly Bone Prison is proccing luckily, and Dreadful Bone Prism is not proccing lucky for some reason. I don't know why. But yeah, so we use the Iron Golem. Every 5th attack causes the shockwave, dealing additional damage to the primary enemy and to enemies behind him. And this thing goes off quite a bit. The Golem, we're scaling its damage. It hits pretty darn hard. It can chunk an elite for like 30 to 50% of its health, and we don't even have the Golem fully juiced yet. So between this and the Golem Slam attack, so the Golem Slam attack will actually stun enemies around him. And again, stun, freeze, these are all CC effects. And it's very, very good for this build. And we'll touch more on that later. Now, for the rest of the gear, the stuff that we didn't talk about, the remaining aspects, you know, of course, we use the gain armor. Anytime we do any kind of damage, we are scaling armor on any piece of gear that we can possibly find. And again, armor applies to our pets as well. They get 30% of our armor. So armor has an insanely good value as someone who controls the dead, someone who summons minions. So you want to be stacking armor basically every slot you can get it. We're also using the maximum skeletal warriors increased by 2. Every single additional minion you can get is going to be a massive damage buff because of Ring of Mendeln. So again, we're getting +3 on our necklace for mages, and we're getting +2 warriors on our boots. Any plus minion, any minion will proc Ring of Mendeln. So this is really, really good. As we talked about, we're using the Bone Spear thing, which makes everything hit by Bone Spear get vulnerable. And again, we're literally just spamming Bone Spear to proc vulnerable, because if you guys didn't know, vulnerable is a separate multiplier, and literally 100% of your vulnerable damage goes to your pets. It's weird. I don't know why it works like that, but that's how it works in the game right now. On our weapon, we're using skeletons gain damage while they're alive, up to 30% after 10 seconds. This is the most consistent way to scale your minions' attack speed, because they literally never die. So this will have 100% uptime. There are a couple other attack speed buffs that you can give to your minions. There's one that says like anytime a minion does damage to a target versus that target, its attack speed goes up, and it's sort of buggy. It doesn't work 100% of the time. And again, like I said before, minion attack speed right now in the game isn't insanely good. It is good, but it's not like, whoa, I want a stat for that. But again, I do feel like that will change, and minion attack speed will be quite good. But this one, again, 100% of time, there's no downside to this whatsoever. There's also, you know, an Army of the Dead attack speed buff. And again, Army of the Dead is just not a good skill in the current state of Diablo. So we forego that as well. And then the sort of two things, right? Like, so as we touched on earlier, like some people are trying to stack Shadow Blight, and it doesn't really work. You don't have a good time on Shadow Blight. And not only that, you have to waste aspect pieces on trying to figure out how to convert some of your damage to shadow. People are converting their bone sword into shadow damage. Maybe people run corpse explosion on the bar, and that doesn't really make sense either. Maybe people try to run the bone prison aspect that spawns the pool of shadow blight underneath mobs. But again, you're wasting so many slots just to try to make Shadow Blade work, kind of. But so instead of that, we're basically having 100% uptime on these two separate damage multipliers. I decided to give this build, right? So for one, we have distant enemies have 8% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds. When they hit you, that's sort of a nice defensive cooldown. But more importantly, you deal up to 40% increased damage to stunned enemies. Now, our Golem, by default, has a cooldown of 10 seconds. We are stacking cooldown reduction in this build, so I think it's closer to like 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 6, somewhere in there. And so the uptime of the stun is really, really good. And on top of that, we're also using the curse, which decreases cooldowns any single time you get hit. So really, the Golem uptime of the stun is pretty nutty here. This effect of us doing 40% increased damage has a really, really high uptime, really, really good value. And why is, if we're doing no damage, right? As we touched on earlier, Bone Spear is doing 0 damage here. But our damage, for some reason, in the current state of Diablo 4, it does scale the Ring of Mendeln damage, right? Minion damage does not scale Mendeln damage, only our damage. So getting damage for yourself, and you'll see the Paragon board choices that we make are sort of centered around that. And some of these build choices that we made are sort of centered around that as well. So currently, it is quite good to scale your own damage. And that's why people try to stack Shadow Blight. And I think it doesn't really pan out. So yeah, again, 40% increased damage to stun enemies is basically 40% more damage to the Ring of Mendeln proc. And then on top of that, we're using deal 25% increased damage while you have a barrier active. And so this is basically, again, we use Bone Storm as almost a strictly a defensive cooldown. So any single time you fight a pack of leads, you'll have barrier. So this is literally just a 25% damage multi that is only up for elites exactly when you need it. You don't need it for trash. So again, I would say that these two alone are going to be better than trying to make Shadow Blight work in the build, because these will have way better uptime and way more consistent uptime than trying to make Shadow Blight work, and won't have some sort of like, you know, requirement of a ton of mobs to be proccing. These will just have insane uptime by themselves. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about here is Decrepify, right? So we touched on it before, where every single time enemies get hit, they have 50% chance to reduce your active cooldowns by 1 second. So this is good for a lot of things. You know, Bone Prison has a cooldown. Your Golem Slam has a cooldown. Bone Storm obviously has a really big cooldown. And there's sort of a lot of misinformation out there about how to proc Decrepify. So there's a few things in this build that can proc Decrepify. Number one is we're not a Thorn Necro here, right? So we're not stacking Thorns damage, but Ring of Mendeln has one Thorns roll on it. And that's perfect, actually, because for some reason, the current state of the game, Thorns does proc Decrepify cooldown. Another thing that procs Decrepify cooldown is the Reaper's wind-up attack. So once every 10 seconds, the Reapers are going to do an attack, and that special attack does proc the cooldown of Decrepify. And then on top of that, Bone Prison will proc it, because Bone Prison has like 100% proc rate for some reason right now. And of course, every single time you cast out a Bone Spear's proc rate is super high, so you're getting crazy good procs for Decrepify. Moving on to Paragon. Paragon is super min-maxed. I've become just a Paragon nerd. We'll give a brief overview here. Of course, we'll have this in the video description so you guys can just follow along and copy paste this exact Paragon board. But first up, we're going to take the damage route instead of going the resistance route. If you guys didn't know, resistance doesn't really have very good value in the current state of Diablo. In the first board, we're going to go the control glyph. Control has just insanely good value inside of the first board. And again, you know, we are constantly CCing mobs. We're slowing mobs through Decrepify. We're stunning mobs with our Golem Slam. We're freezing mobs with our Skeletal Mages. So control has really good value in this build. And again, my CC damage affects the Ring of Mendeln procs. So scaling your own CC damage does affect Mendeln. So there is more int choices to get here, but we sort of ran out of points, and you'll see exactly why. Moving on, we're going to pick up the Flesh Eater board. Again, we are literally spamming raised skeletons because it not only heals our minions, but also gives us essence back. So Flesh Eater has insanely good uptime, and it has just a flat 40% damage multiplier, and that does apply to Ring of Mendeln, and it does apply to our minions. We go to the left side, and we rotate the board to be this way so we can pick up a little bit of additional crit strike damage and damage to injure enemies along the way. Juicy, juicy. Moving into the middle of the Flesh Eater board, I think that this is literally best in class for picking up +2 magic nodes. As you can see here, we've picked up Amplify. Amplify's secondary effect says the cursed enemies take 10% increased damage from your minions as long as you have 40 int in the radius. But on top of that, it says it grants 150% bonus damage to all magic nodes in range. And why is that good? Because we can get literally 20% elite damage on just these 3 nodes. That's 60% elite damage, which is absolutely insane for any build, on the way to getting 32% elite damage, and then plus 16% more damage to elites if you meet the secondary requirements. So this little section right here with the Amplify is just insanely good. We pick up this little node over here. Again, all res is not that great, but there's a free 10 int right there. So we can get that secondary 40 int requirement. Moving on, we next go to the Cult Leaderboard. There's a lot of things on the Cult Leaderboard that we want, because again, we are a MinionMancer. But on this particular board, we pick up the Dead Razor glyph, 100% bonus to minion damage and damage reduction modifiers. And on this particular board, we have lots of damage reduction and lots of damage, flat damage. So this thing pumps like crazy. Literally just getting this board juiced and getting the Dead Razor glyph leveled up, this alone is almost all the mitigation you need to sort of carry your minions pretty much all the way, I would say, until probably like Nightmare 60, Nightmare 65. We'll talk about that a little bit later. They will just not die. It's so much so much mitigation, just these matching nodes. So again, we pick up 40 ints, because with 40 ints, whenever your minions deal damage to an enemy, it takes 1% increased damage from you and your minions. And this has basically double dip value, because our minions get more damage and us getting more damage is more ring and Mendeln damage. It's also going to be super important to pick up Cult Leader. We get 50% increased damage for each minion type we have. And of course, we have all three. So that's 45% flat damage modifier, because we have all three damage minions types. We're going to pick up this juicy rare node for skeletal warrior damage, and we're definitely going to meet the secondary requirement. So we're going to get just nutty amounts of skeletal warrior damage. We're also going to pick up the skeletal mage damage, which is not as good as the skeletal warriors nodes, because again, all res is just not great in the current state of the game. After this board, we're going to move on up to the hulking monstrosity. This is where our golem starts to pop off. The golem will not die. He is very, very strong, especially after you get these Dead Razor nodes and then the minion nodes here. The golem will basically never die. I would say probably up until Nightmare 70. He is just nutty tanky, but then you're going to get all this stuff and it's going to make him a god. So you're going to get Hulking Monstrosity that gives him 40% increased damage and 40% increased maximum life. So he's literally just going to be unkillable. On the way up, we're going to pick up these borrowed strength nodes. So this is 20% damage while golems are active, and total armor while golems are active. So just as long as the golem's not dead, and again, he'll never die, basically, you're going to get 30% increased damage. And this is a separate additive multiplier. So that is good. And there's really nothing like this in the game. So this is the only way to get this sort of separate additive bucket of damage, which is just really, really nice. So that's why we're sort of picking up all the nodes around it, because this is sort of its own bucket. And that's just a good thing to stack in this game. And with this particular board, we're going to go with the Golem Glyph. For every 5 willpower, you get 19.8 increased damage with your golem. And on the way out here, we sort of pick up 114.8% at level 21 additional golem damage. And in addition to picking up, this crazy amount of golem armor, in addition to picking up this crazy amount of golem damage along the way, the golem just gets juiced after you get this board. After that, we move on up to Scent of Death. And on the way, we get ourselves just a little bit more crit damage, some damage to healthy enemies. We will probably not be meeting the stat requirement here for the additional secondary benefits, but that's fine. And with this board, we're going to get the Skeletal Mage Glyph. There's a lot of int on this particular part of the board. So the Skeletal Mage has really good value here. On top of these rare nodes having pretty good value as well. You get damage to enemies and plus main stat, armor plus main stat. Now, arguably the most important Paragon board is going to be Bone Graft, because of the essence on kill. Now, this should be your second board choice, and then you should sort of respec your board every single time you have more and more points, if that makes any sense. So after I get my first board done, I'm going to go into Bone Graft. I'm going to get the essence on kill just so I can keep spamming those bone spears, It's absolutely necessary. And then when I have enough Paragon points to sort of spec out of it and then spec back into it by attaching in another board, that's when you do that, if that makes sense. So it's super duper important to get the Bone Graft board straight away. With the Bone Graft board, we're going to get Skeletal Warrior damage by stacking decks, and there's just enough in this circle by not having to go too far or too weird to hit that minimum 25 requirement. So Skeletal Warriors get 20% increased armor, which is just great because, we give a lot of armor to our pets. We're stacking a lot of armor in this build. So again, tanky. But yeah, that's sort of the board in total. We have really min-maxed this so that you can get all the runes, especially all the glyphs for each minion type. Because again, minions are doing all of the heavy lifting here outside of Ring of Mendeln. Talking about stat priority, as we touched on earlier, Lucky is really important and is probably our number one stat in this build. We're a crit build, so we want to stack as much crit and crit damage as we possibly can in the build. Vulnerable has insanely good value in the current state of Diablo 4, but not only that, but for minions, minions get 100% of your vulnerable. So any sort of vulnerable you can get on any piece is going to be super rank 1. So starting out with the helmet, I sort of like this. I like armor, as we touched on. Minions get your armor. You having a lot of armor has good value. Cooldown reduction is going to be super, super important. Again, we are stacking cooldown in this build. Getting max life roll is really nice. And then a main stat, 45 int rolls is really good too. Now you can argue that you can roll a level 25 sorcerer, take a helmet from your necro, give it to your sorcerer, re-roll a stat on the sorcerer, and you can get a stat called Lucky Hit Chance while you have Barrier. Now, it is nice. I don't know that it's necessarily worth it, because again, you're not going to have 100% uptime on your barrier. You're going to have really good uptime on your barrier, especially when you have to fight a giant elite pack. But is it worth the additional, 7% lucky hit chance you're probably going to get? I don't know. I played around with it a little bit. It didn't feel like crazy. It felt like these stats were a lot more impactful, but you can give it a shot. You can get that on your helmet and you can get that on your offhand. For chest, again, armor. We're stacking armor, super good value. Life, no brainer here. We're actually stacking minion life as well. This is a pretty low roll for minion life, but anywhere you can get minion life, it's also pretty good besides the jewelry. Damage reduction from close enemies can roll pretty high in the chest. I like this stat. It's usually the stuff that overwhelms you is what gets you in this build. It's not usually distant enemies, although you will get one shot to race if you stand in their line. If you hear a corpse lance and you don't hear, the trigger, the audio trigger, you will get one shot by that, especially in higher nightmare dungeons. But like those are avoidable versus like just getting overwhelmed is not really avoidable. And that's why we use topazes in gear, because we get damage reduction while control impaired. Because if you do get frozen, you're sort of super tanky for that little bit of time you're frozen, because of all these topazes in your armor is just stacking. But you can get damage reduction from distant enemies if you find you're dying a lot more to distant enemies. You can get damage reduction while fortified. Fortified doesn't have 100% uptime. It really has good uptime when you need it, so it is a possibility. I wouldn't say it's a bad stat to get, but yeah, they're all sort of situational, and they all have you could make an argument for each. So it's really up to you and your play style. For gloves, I love these gloves. We want lucky hit chance. We want crit strike chance. We want attack speed, because attack speed is more bone spear procs. Attack speed, our pets get 30% of our attack speed. And then main stat is just more damage for us and our pets. So it's basically like double dipping. You could have plus bone spear on your gloves here, maybe, instead of, probably over attack speed, but I think that these gloves are much better, because again, we're not stacking your own damage for bone spear anyways. For pants, I do like getting ranks to bone prison. It does reduce the cooldown quite a bit. And again, bone prison has a 100% lucky hit chance. So it is actually nutty in the current state of game. It's also an insanely good skill in and of itself, because it does trap enemies. So you can sort of like be like, no, you wait, and I'll attack the guys that are in front of me. It's really, really nice. You can also get maximum minion life on pants. So I chose to do that here as well. Main stat, again, is just a flat damage mod across all your stuff, and it's a separate multiplier. So main stat is really, really good value if you want to put some damage on your pants. I have damage reduction while injured here. I'd probably do like damage reduction while close if I could sort of redo these pants, but it's still really, really good. Like that, you want to have at least one damage reduction while injured roll on like either your boots or your pants. So you could argue that this is not bad, because we have 80% damage reduction while injured, and that's sort of when we're at our highest risk, which is fine. But again, it's sort of up to you and your play style and where you think your weakness is. If it's close, if it's distant, if it's like fortified, if it's whatever. You have a lot of a choice. Boots, a super important rule here is essence cost reduction and movement speed. These are two must-haves. Again, we want to reduce the cost of bone spear so we can spam it a lot more often, because the more often we can spam it, the more lucky hits we're going to get. Main stat is also, again, just really good across the board. It's just a separate damage multiplier. And again, I think that these are basically perfectly rolled boots. Damage reduction while injured can roll on boots, and pretty much nothing else that's of value can roll besides maybe dodge. Dodge is good for pets because it gives them a chance to avoid CC, but damage reduction while injured is way better. For our weapon, this is super duper important. We're using a wand. Why a wand, Fluff? Because it has a base 15% lucky hit chance, which is actually nutty. So you have to have a wand. This is a wand wielding build. If you didn't have the Ring of Mendeln, you could use a two-hander, because again, your damage, having a big two-hand juicy weapon will make your minions do more damage. But since this is more of like a Ring of Mendeln slash minion build, having a one-hander is fine. And again, it's all about that lucky hit chance, and 15% is just too good. The three stats that you really want on a wand or int, and crit strike damage and vulnerable damage, those are absolutely non-negotiable. You want those no matter what. The fourth one is, you can get damage to stun, you can get damage to slows. I like damage to slows because it's just a higher uptime than damage to stun. But one stat I actually really like here is plus 42 or whatever it is, 52 all stat, because that will allow you to unlock the fourth attached Paragon board, the secondary requirements. So we just meet those if we get all stat on our wand. So that can be super duper important, because that's more armor for your golem, but not only that, it's 70% increased golem damage, which is no slouch. So I kind of like all stats. Plus, it's just more int, and int is just flat good. So I do like all stat on the weapon here. On the necklace, this is rolled pretty well. So Hellbent Commander, I do think will be the best passive for a MinionMancer. Cooldown reduction is also best in slot. Essence cost reduction is also best in slot because it lets us spam Bone Spear more. But I think ideally, if I could get percent intelligence, that would be the play over total armor, because that would just be insane amounts of intelligence. So that's probably what I'd go with over armor. But this is still a pretty damn good necklace. Ring of Mendeln, it has implicit value, so you can't change that. It has a minion attack speed. Has Lucky Chance, thank goodness. Has Lucky Chance as a minion life, which is great. And has Thorns. Again, we want one Thorns roll on one piece of gear, and this provides that. A perfect rolled ring would be vulnerable, crit strike chance, crit strike damage, and lucky hit, which you can see we are missing the lucky. So that's sort of a bad ring, but we haven't found anything that's really great yet. For offhands can roll cooldown reduction as an implicit. So definitely get a focus that has cooldown reduction, but they can also roll lucky. They can roll crit strike chance. It can roll minion life, and it can roll cooldown reduction. So that is super duper good. All right. Now, as promised, I sort of wanted to touch on like sort of the weird caveats with this particular setup. Again, for some reason, Bone Spear in its Bone's Prison in its current form, if you pick the Ghastly Bone Prison, it will make the minions trapped. As long as you get one minion trapped inside, it will for some reason trigger the Ring of Mendeln. It doesn't make sense to me. I think that this is a bug. And again, you can cancel prematurely your Bone Prison. So if I cast it, I can cancel it if I just hit the button again. But we can see here, if I choose the other rune, which is the better rune for this particular setup, to fortify instead, I will not get that lucky hit chance proc if I trap something inside. I just need to find literally any mob. Hello? See, nothing's getting Mendeln procs. It's sort of a weird skill interaction in the current state of the game. So now we put the vulnerable back on, we trap a minion inside, bing, bang, boom. There's a Mendeln proc. It's sort of weird. Now, again, I think if this gets nerfed, I would assume that the offensive power that breaks a segment of Bone Prison will still trigger lucky. And I would assume it's going to be a really high chance of lucky. So I'd still think the Bone Prison with this aspect over, say, like the barrier aspect will be the way to go. But if both of those get nerfed, if Bone Prison just no longer triggers lucky altogether, then we're going to drop all of this and go Corpse Tendrils. Corpse Tendrils will stun. I would say we don't need the vulnerable, but the other one is terrible. Like the 35% chance to drop a Blood Orb. We're not stacking any sort of Blood Orb juice in this build, so I don't like that rune at all. Even though we have 100% uptime on vulnerable, I'd probably still go this route. And then I'd switch one of those aspects into the aspect of Grasping Vines, where we get increased crit strike chance for 6 seconds and increased critical strike damage after casting Corpse. Anything gets touched by Corpse Tendrils, basically. And again, that'll be quite good. This would be a good choice altogether, but I do think the Bone Prison right now in the current state of the game is just a better choice. But this is a really close second. Now, as we mentioned earlier as well, minion damage does not affect Ring of Mendeln damage. So I can stack like 5,000 minion damage, and that has nothing to do with the Ring of Mendeln procs. So you might ask, well, why would you invest in minions? Well, you already have to invest in minions for them to survive, because you want them to trigger Ring of Mendeln. You don't want them to be dying on elite packs and resummoning them, and they're not going to get the lucky hit chance proc. So like, we're already committing to being a minion build. So to me, this is absolutely the best way to just go full minions with Ring of Mendeln. There's also a weird bug in the current state of the game, and you guys are going to run into this without question. When you run into suppressor affix, and you'll see it in the game, some of the gameplay above, I do it. So basically, if you run into suppressor, a trick you can do, and this sucks, but you know, classic Blizzard, you can get inside the suppressor bubble, you can unequip the ring and then re-equip the ring, and it'll start triggering Ring of Mendeln again. So it's sort of this like buggy fix, because right now suppressor for some reason is bugged for Ring of Mendeln. It can't like go through the barrier. I don't know why. So I try to avoid any Nightmare Dungeon that says elites have suppressor affix. I also avoid Nightmare Dungeons that have the Drifting Shade. That will literally just take out half of your minions. Not like from dying, they'll stay alive, but they just get dazed, and they get dazed for like a long time, like 5 to 10 seconds. So avoid Drifting Shade, avoid a suppressor at all costs. And again, the current state of minions, they're supposed to be just absorbing 30% of your shit. basically. They're supposed to get, 30% of your damage, 30% of your attack speed, 30% of your crit, 30%, right? But there's things that are sort of going outside the boundaries. Like we touched on in the video, you want to make sure you stack vulnerable, because vulnerable, for some reason, they get 100% of that. They're only going to get 30% of your crit and crit strike damage. However, Mendeln gets 100% of your crit strike damage. So again, Mendeln is based on your own stats. So like that's why stacking int is really good. That's why stacking crit damage, vulnerable is all super duper good. Because for some reason this like overrides the minions stats and only focuses on yours. I do think for maybe like 75, 80 level Nightmare Dungeons, you might have to drop the mage affix for them doing Blizzard into the 20% additional mitigation while you have 7 or more minions affix, which isn't a big loss. Again, I just like this because it will occasionally freeze and kill stuff off screen, which is just really nice. And it's just flat more damage for like speed farming rifts. But that's pretty much going to do it for the video. Again, guys, I will leave a super detailed, not written guide because I'm not writing anything, but like a Diablo planner layout, so you guys can follow that along. It'll have the Paragon board on it, it'll have stat allocations on it, it'll have all the aspects on it, so you guys can have something to reference. So just look down in the video description for that, as always. But let me know what you guys think. This build absolutely blasts Nightmare Dungeons. It is, I think, I like the Shadowmancer build personally. If you guys haven't checked that build out, do go check that out. I think it's super duper fun. But I do sort of like this build better for Helltides, because mobs can get like super spread out. They're all over the place. And Shadow is kind of like you're just chasing stuff down because it's just you. You have no minions. So I do kind of like this build for Helltides, but I like Shadow for like literally everything else. It's more of my play style. I'm not a big minion fan, but we wanted to make a minion build for you guys because that's, I think, our number one request was like, Fluff, please help us make a good minion build. So I hope that I delivered here. This is, I think, the best. I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but I think this is the best minion build I've seen on the interwebs. But let me know what you guys think. If you have any suggestions, if you think that this build can be improved, we did do a lot of play testing. We did a lot of min-maxing for the Paragon board. So we do appreciate any support you guys want to offer. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. We are still bleeding YouTube subscribers for some reason. And do come over to Twitch, drop a like, drop a subscribe, give us your Twitch Prime if you want. It's up to you. If you like IRL content, of course, we are on Instagram. Follow me at Lord of the Fluff. Follow me on Twitter, _Lord__Fluffy on Twitter, for just like gaming news and stream updates, stuff like that. Now, of course, we're not done yet. Do follow the channel for more Necromancer guides, maybe even other class guides eventually, but obviously Necro is our main focus. But I do hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, boys, stay fluffy. Peace out.